Alright, so this video is going to be a bit more off the cuff and a bit less formal because it's a wide-ranging topic involving a lot of factors. It's hard to write about, but I'll begin. So, an important thing you need to understand about the medieval period, and really many other periods throughout history, is that noble titles like Duke, Margrave, and Count, though not Baron or Lord, were not always hereditary titles, at least in theory. These typically originated as appointed offices, and then they gradually became hereditary. So, how did this happen, and what did those offices look like before they became hereditary and attached to a specific territory? So, in the early medieval period, the economy typically did not operate on cash or money because the money economy had started breaking down significantly, especially in Western Europe during the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire. Instead, people were paid in land. In theory, at first, these grants were not permanent, but they would be attached to some sort of office, like that of Count or that of Duke. And they would provide not only personal income, but also the funds and resources necessary to execute the functions of that office, such as enforcing the law, or gathering troops, or paying retainers, and so on. But there's already a problem here. When I pay you in land, I'm essentially giving you the purse from which I'm paying you, and I'm expecting you not to run away with the purse, or to, take stuff from it without my permission. Now, of course, land isn't a mobile good, so you can't just run off with it, but you can build fortifications on it, and that entrenches yourself in your position. Now, if I'm a king, and I'm a king worth my salt, I could probably stop you. But A, what if fortifications are absolutely necessary for defense? And B, what if everyone is doing it, and I'm too preoccupied to stop everyone? What if I'm just a weak king? What if the people managing the many fortifications band against me and then assert a right to hold on to it for life, or even to pass it on to their kids? So this is the kind of situation that obtained in West Francia, what is now France, in the 9th and 10th centuries. With the chaos that followed the partition of Charlemagne's empire and the advent of Viking and Hungarian raiders, it was necessary for local elites to start building their own fortifications, and many of them. And although King Charles the Bald tried to curtail this process, he wasn't practically able to do so. People kind of called his bluff all at once. So counts and dukes were able to entrench themselves in their positions, quite literally, by building trenches and wooden walls into their offices. So by the end of the 10th century, the French monarchy was extremely weak, and there was little it could do to enforce the non-hereditary character of the counties and the duchies. By force of custom, this became recognized, especially since these officers, who were now lords, would have invested in some of the lands attached to their offices. So what was usurped would gradually become harder and harder to separate from what was gained honestly. And if you wanted to encourage investment, hereditary ownership and possession was actually not such a bad idea. Another factor was the lack of infrastructure, both institutional and physical. Without money, you can't have bureaucrats. Moreover, roads had decayed since the fall of Rome, and in the absence of a bureaucracy and rapid communication, the primary way in which to get things done will be personal connections with local elites and the broader population. And naturally, if my dad was a duke and he was friends with the other elites in the duchy, he'd be able to gather some of the resources necessary for the execution of the king's will. And if our dads were friends, we're more likely to be on friendly terms and to know one another, or at least, And assuming my dad behaved well, it would probably be more efficient to let him pass on his title to me, assuming, he had proved his loyalty, or another relative who also knew the other elites in the territory. And without a good bureaucracy and communication system, micromanaging your servants is basically impossible. This is why, for instance, the system of soldier farmers established by Charles Martel in the 8th century very, very, very rapidly went from non-hereditary to hereditary. It just wasn't feasible to micromanage that kind of thing. Now, this sort of thing played out throughout much of Europe, albeit unevenly. So the case in France was probably the most extreme, whereas major titles in Germany, they didn't become formally hereditary until the 12th century under Frederick Barbarossa, although practically they had already been semi-hereditary for some time, especially at the level of the counts. An important countermeasure to these centripetal forces, though, was the establishment of prince-bishoprics, because bishops were expected to be celibate, and they couldn't pass on their office to a child, and because they lacked legitimate kids. So throughout Europe, but especially in the Kingdom of Germany, the core of the Holy Roman Empire, major lands were granted to the church, with the understanding that the king would be able to appoint the bishops. You start to see this a lot under Otto the Great, and then it really accelerates towards the end of the 10th century and the early 11th century. And at this time, the papacy was quite weak politically and couldn't really object to the king's appointing bishops. And this arrangement would pave the way for a conflict that would really shake the empire massively in the 11th and 12th century, the investiture controversy, which I will cover eventually, between the Pope and the Emperor over the appointment of bishops. In the early 11th century, in the mid-11th century, the papacy really starts to become strong enough to reassert its right to control the Western Church. What's really interesting about all this, though, for example, the inability to micromanage local areas, the importance of patronage, and the like, is that much of it really continued beyond the Middle Ages, and it's not really unique to the medieval period. You know, in 17th century France, for instance, sure, governors of the provinces were appointed, but at the local level, many of the offices were hereditary or quasi-hereditary, and governors couldn't really get anything done without leveraging their personal connections and appealing to various networks of patronage. This wasn't really unique to the medieval period, and someday I'd probably like to address why the term feudalism is a bit problematic in a future video, although I don't think it's altogether worthless. Anyway, this was a short video. Thank you for listening, assuming you did listen, and I hope to see you guys again.